Welcome to the Thursday, October 26th, 2017 session in our series on the rise of commercial space businesses in Asia. I'm Richard Dasher. I direct the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center. We produce this series, and we're very delighted to have both our students who've registered for the course coming in and also visitors from the community. These programs will be up on YouTube. Please watch our website, asia.stanford.edu, when we publish the links up on the internet, you'll be able to see those. So I'm really happy that today we are able to bring a serial entrepreneur and also a spaceship designer to be with us. Dr. Susmita Mohanty is really India's first entrepreneur in space businesses who's also a woman. And she has co-founded and led two companies before her current company. Her current company is Earth to Orbit, which is a launch services company, correct?
Well, I'm on to my fourth venture, but I'll...
Okay, the fourth venture, we'll let you talk about that. The first two were Moonfront, which was a San Francisco-based venture in the early 2000s, and Liquefier, which is based in Vienna, Austria, and it's still ongoing. Before she became an entrepreneur, she worked in business development for the International Space Station program with Boeing in California, and she also worked on shuttle Mir missions at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. She's worked with people from many different countries in various capacities about doing things in outer space. Americans, Japanese, Europeans, Russians, and Indians. She's been honored in Washington, D.C. with the International Achievement Award for promoting international cooperation through entrepreneurial space ventures. She has been voted into Financial Times list of 25 Indians to watch. And in 2016, she was nominated to the World Economic Forum Global Future Council for Space Technologies. So we're really delighted that Susmita can come and be with us today. Let me just turn the microphone over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I've been to this campus a few times, but I still lose my way. And then you have construction happening. So how many of you are aware that India has a space program that goes back to the late 60s? Okay, well, that's good. So today I think what we'll do is we'll take a look at where India is, both with its government space program and the new space entrepreneurs. I'll just add a couple more words to the introduction that Richard just gave you. I've been in the space business for more than 20 years now. In the late 90s, I worked for Boeing and NASA, and I've been an entrepreneur for almost 16 years, so to speak. I started my first company in San Francisco. It was a very small consulting firm. It was more of a learning experience. We were 6 partners. And then I started my second company in Vienna in Austria, which is a space architecture firm. What that means is the Vienna company designs habitats, rovers, spacesuits, suit boats for living in outer space in the near future. So we're looking at what kind of rovers would you need for short sorties and long sorties on Moon or Mars, for example. What kind of deployable habitats can you design, build, launch, land, and sort of build out when you're on planetary surfaces, things like that. That company is 12 years old now, and we are the only company where engineers, architects, industrial designers, and scientists sort of work together. So we take a multidisciplinary approach to design as opposed to the engineering-centric approach that you find at most government space agencies, which I think is obsolete. And then I moved back to India in 2008, and I started my company Earth to Orbit. We flew foreign payloads on the PSLV. It sounds very simple, but it's not. From the day a client comes to us to launch a satellite to the day we launch it, it's easily 4 to 5 years. And what that involves is you give legal, contractual, technical support right up to launch. So I've done things like exploration design, then I did a couple of rocket launches. We launched a Japanese satellite on the PSLV. We launched the first Google satellite on the PSLV. My client was Skybox Imaging, which, by the way, Richard, is a Stanford startup. And then Skybox, in fact, was the first space startup that raised money in the Valley, so VC money, because most space enterprises are funded by government funds or taxpayer funds, including Elon Musk, who gets his billions from NASA and DoD. So Skybox was sort of a first in that sense, and then they got acquired by Google, and Google renamed it as Terabella. And recently they got bought by Planet, which is another commercial Earth observation constellation company. Now I've moved on to my fourth venture. So I've kind of come full circle. First I looked at Moon and Mars and how we're going to live there, then did some rocket launches, and now I'm looking back at the Earth. And this new venture is about Earth observation data analytics. What that means is, those of you who are familiar with the world of big data analytics, you add another layer of satellite imagery and drone imagery to any kind of problem you're trying to solve with big data. The beauty is that we live in times where we have satellite imagery is becoming affordable, and it's also the revisit rate is improving because of the new constellations that are emerging, commercial constellations. How many of you are familiar with Planet or Spire or Skybox? You are. Cool. So that, and when you combine it with machine learning algorithms and deep learning, and the cloud compute power that's available to us, we can do fantastic things in terms of generating intelligence, actionable intelligence, to solve social, environmental, business problems. So with that, I think I'll start my presentation. So this is a very fundamental question we often ask and get asked, is why do we explore? I think, to me, personally, the answer is very simple. It's because we are human, and it is in our nature to explore. That's a photograph of the first Everest climb, Edmund Hillary. He was a mountaineer and explorer from New Zealand, and Tenzing Norgay. He was a Sherpa climber from Nepal. And the beauty of this picture also answers another question that I'm often asked. People ask me, why does India have a space program? Why is India going to Mars? Or why is India going to the moon? I don't see a relation. I mean, the obvious sort of sub-question is, you have so many problems here on Earth to solve. So I think the answer is fairly simple, that going to space and solving problems here on Earth are not an either-or situation. I think we have to do both, and that's how I look at our space program. Let's go to the next one. So I don't know how many of you have seen this photograph, but it did go viral on social media. And it sort of was a wake-up call even in the aerospace world, which is largely dominated by men. I mean, when I arrived on the scene in 1998, I think NASA and ISRO, which is the Indian Space Agency, had the most number of women. Most of the European space agencies, the only women you would see were the secretaries or a handful of scientists. So I think ISRO has had women in significant numbers right from the onset. Today, if you look at the workforce of the Indian Space Research Organization, there are about 13,500 employees, plus or minus, and about 12% of the workforce is women. So I think it's a beautiful photograph of women in silk saris celebrating the arrival of the spacecraft in Mars orbit. For those of you who followed the coverage of this mission in the media, I think the thing they were all talking about is they were saying it was done in a very frugal manner. It's a mission that flew for $70 million as compared to a NASA mission which flew around the same time for about $670 million. But I think, to me, that was not the most exciting part of the Mars mission that India launched. What was most exciting to me as a designer, as a space person, is that the Indian Space Agency managed to pull off a planetary mission in just 14 months, 14 months. A mission of this magnitude usually takes 6 to 7 years for any space agency to pull it off. So from the day the budget was approved to the day they launched was just 14 months. So that, to me, is the kicker, not so much the price tag. Let's go to the next one. I think I just did speak a little bit about sort of the gender balance and the mix of people who run projects at ISRO. We have quite a few women heading satellite projects. When I returned to India in 2008, the rocket, the launch vehicle program office was headed by a woman. So it's a fairly good mix in that sense, and a very spirited team that's working on our space program. Next slide, please. Let me talk a little bit about the budget. So if you look at the top 5 or 6 spacefaring nations, and let's compare the budgets so that you guys can visualize what's the scale here. The NASA budget, for the longest time, it had been about $18 billion, 1/8, and recently I think it's been hiked to $19 billion. It's more than the space budget of all nations combined, just to put things in perspective. The European Space Agency, which is a conglomerate of more than 20 countries, their budget is approximately $5 billion. I'm just giving you rough orders of magnitude so you can compare. So NASA is 19, ESA is about 5. I think Japan is probably around 1.75, France is 2.75, we're talking billions of dollars. And India now is approximately 1.4 billion. So if you look at the budget allocated and technological capabilities, India is easily in the top 5 to 6 spacefaring countries in the world. So this is a statement I often make to people, especially from the press. So for a country, for a subcontinent the size of India, India is pretty much as big as sort of Western Europe in its size. And diversity, having a fleet of communication satellites, remote sensing satellites, and its own GPS constellation is really not a luxury. It's a necessity. The next slide kind of explains why. I mean, to many of you in the audience, you probably already are aware of this. But I think the kind of Earth applications, the kind of downstream applications that can be concocted out of this mix of remote sensing / Earth observation, meteorology, telecommunications, and GPS is endless. I mean, it literally applies to every single sector. I've listed a few, but it really covers everything that we do here on Earth. We're using satellites one way or the other. Let's go to the next slide, and the next. I'll walk you through a visual journey of the Indian space program so as for you to have an idea of how it's progressed over the last 50 years. So these are some early photographs. How many are familiar with the French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson? So some of these early photographs of rocket parts being carried on the bicycle, I think the next one has been taken by Henri. He was married to, I forget his wife's name, but she was good friends with Nehru's sister. So he had access to some of these kind of unusual events. And this is one such photograph by Henri. You can see the coconut palms there. So this is taken in the southern state of Kerala, in a place called Thumba. And that's where we did our first experimental rocket launch. These photographs also remind me a little bit of the black and white photographs I've seen of the jet propulsion guys. You know, the young rocketeers used to go strap together things and launch them in the valley down south from here. Let's go to the next. This is quite an amazing picture as well. This is a satellite. It's the Apple satellite, one of the early ones, Aryabhatta Bhaskara Apple, 1981, being carried in a bullock cart, believe it or not. I think Richard's little buggy here has better suspension than the bullock cart. And then we're looking at 1983, guys, and that's a ComSat, the INSAT series, being loaded onto the belly of a cargo carrier and being flown to Kourou to be launched on the Ariane rocket, the French rocket. So India builds 4 categories, 4 kinds of satellites. Communication satellites, well, any spacefaring nation does for that matter. Communications, remote sensing, GPS, and space science missions. So that's your ComSat. Let's go to the next one. We're looking at a ComSat up close. The next. That's the first remote sensing satellite. India has what it calls the IRS system. It has mainly 2 kinds of satellites, the Cartosat series and the ResourceSat series. The next. So 1993, that's your first PSLV launch. So any country that is launch capable needs 2 kinds of rockets, broadly speaking. One that takes you to sort of a low Earth orbit, or a sun-synchronous orbit, which is the kind of orbit that Earth observation satellites fly in, and that's up to 900 to 1,000 kilometers from the Earth. The next picture, that's the heavy lifter. That's your GSLV, or the geostationary launch vehicle. So the other rocket is the one that takes you to GEO. It's about 36,000 kilometers from the Earth. It's an equatorial orbit. And that's used for communication satellites. That's the kind of orbit the Falcon 9 that Elon flies takes you to. So that's our heavy lifter. It's still in a developmental phase. The previous one that I showed you, the PSLV, is a very mature, very reliable rocket. This one has a proven capability of 2.5 tons, and now they're trying to get to the next level, which is about 4.5 tons lift. Oh, well, now this is 2008, and we are looking at Chandrayaan, which was our first moon orbiter. We can go to the next slide. And I'm showing you some images from the mission, and the next. Yeah, we can go to the next one. And that's the Mars orbiter, called Mangalyaan, and it was renamed MOM, Mars Orbiter Mission. Interestingly, ISRO doesn't have the kind of PR that NASA or ESA have. It's almost non-existent, if you ask me. So often people in India also don't know very much about what's going on, except the rocket launches that happen. So let's go to the next one. Interestingly enough, now some of the younger engineers that are part of the ISRO's workforce are in their late 20s and thereabouts. So you'll see that now they have a new website and they're publishing a lot more information. So if you go to the website, you will find quite a bit of information these days. Okay, so what do you think is this? It's a splashdown. Come on, guys. That's right. It's a manned space capsule. So this is what you're looking at. It is the second technology demonstrator mission where this capsule was launched into orbit, and I don't remember how many days it stayed in orbit, and then it comes back and splashes in the Bay of Bengal from where it is recovered, and it can be theoretically, it can be refurbished and reused on the next launch. So these are technology demonstrators, but it also shows you that India has a human space program underway, and they're planning a residential astronaut training facility outside of Bangalore. And this is part of the human space program where they are also working on these crew modules. I believe this can carry a crew of 3 people. Yeah, so this is from 2013 to 2016. The Indian Space Agency launched a constellation of 7 satellites for our own GPS constellation. So how many GPS constellations are there in the world, guys? Do you know? Yeah. Yeah, close. You're right. So it's essentially we had the American one and the Russian one. Then the Europeans decided that they will put up something called Galileo. And then Galileo, it was sort of, it got stuck in certain financial management-related hurdles. China and India were initially going to participate in the Galileo program, and then they backed out. And I believe China is also going to put up, or have started putting up, their own constellation, and so has India. So India and China are the countries that are now going to have their own. We have one. We had problems with the first satellite where the Swiss atomic clock was giving us some trouble. And so you have to keep replenishing these constellation satellites. So we have to keep replenishing it. This is a constellation of 7. It's called Navik. Let's go to the next one. All right, what does this look like? Right, it does look like the space shuttle. It is indeed a scaled version of the space shuttle. India is calling it its reusable launch vehicle, or the RLV. And they flew a demonstrator mission in May of 2016, and that was a successful mission. So they'll slowly scale it up to about 40 meters. This is, I don't know, I think it's 1/6 the scale of the final reusable launch vehicle. Let's go to the next one. Okay, I guess some of you must have read about this. Of the 104 satellites, so let me add a couple of words as to why this slide is very, very relevant to my last venture. So Skybox Imaging was my client. What that meant is they wanted to launch SkySat on the PSLV. And they were a startup, and we were a startup. We knew there were hurdles. It wasn't that simple to take an American satellite and launch it on an Indian rocket. There were essentially 3 big hurdles for us to overcome. The first one was a US embargo that was imposed on India in 1998 when India conducted nuclear tests, and that prevents American companies from selling space components to India. The second was ITAR. How many of you are familiar with ITAR? Okay, so ITAR, guys, in my view, is archaic now. It was written back in the 60s during the Cold War, and it needs to be overhauled. It hasn't been. Obama took some little steps. What he did is essentially he moved the space components from the State Department to the Trade Department, making the licensing a little bit, the paperwork a little easier. But really, no one has reformed. It needs reform. ITAR needs to be reformed completely. So what happens with ITAR, let's say this microphone here is made in the United States, and it needs to fly on an Indian rocket. So by definition, this is a defense article, and it needs clearances to fly. So ITAR the problem with ITAR is that it has very high barriers across all kinds of technologies. So whether it's an astronaut diaper or a rocket engine, the barriers are fairly high for both. So they need to differentiate between the different kinds of technologies that can go out of the country, whether it's for launch or for any other reason. Anyway, so that was your second hurdle. And the third hurdle was the lobbying in Washington, D.C. by big companies to prevent business from leaving the country. Whereas the reality is that if you are a company that builds small satellites, like Planet Labs, like Skybox, and others, you don't have as many launch opportunities here in the US, because most of them are heavy lifters, the Delta, the Atlas, the Falcon 9. So we took it upon ourselves to sort of find a way to overcome these 3 big hurdles. It was really a diplomatic exercise for us. We met diplomats in DC and Delhi, and it sort of took us almost 3 years to get the first ever waiver to override the ban, to sort of get a special permission to take an American satellite and launch it on an Indian rocket. So I think, and then it took us another year to get all the signatures on both sides, and yet another year for a launch agreement to be signed between ISRO and Skybox. So what I'm trying to tell you here is this was, how many of you have seen the movie Bridge of Spies by Steven Spielberg? Okay, so there's a scene in there where Tom Hanks is sitting with the Russian consul in East Berlin and saying, let's talk about things that our countries cannot. So in some ways, we did that as entrepreneurs. It's soft diplomacy. And we did manage to build a bridge, however tenuous. So the door is not wide open, but it is ajar. So if you are a small satellite maker and you want to launch on the Indian rocket, the PSLV, it's possible. And the 104 that you see here, of these, I think 96 were US satellites, of which a significant chunk was Planet Lab Dove satellites. I think what is very cool about this is not just the number. It's not just the 104, the world record, and that kind of thing. I think if any of you have ever seen a rocket launch or know how it works, so once the rocket gets to a certain altitude, and you have to jettison these birds, one after the other, you have to do it at the right altitude, at the right, it's like choreography, it's like ballet, because you're in microgravity. So the precision with which these satellites are inserted into their desired orbit is the real kicker. And I remember after the Google mission, one of my friends from Germany said that they were amazed and really pleased with the precision with which ISRO can pull this off. That is very important, guys. It's not just a number. Let's go to the next one. Let's talk a little bit about innovation and what we mean by innovation. And does the World Index really look at innovation in a way that comprehensively covers innovation in different geographies around the world? And frugal engineering, I mean, this term is often used for the Indian space program. I think it's not so much only frugal engineering. When I look at the process, let's go to the next slide, Richard. So when I look at the process, you know, having lived and worked around the world for almost 15 years, the way things are done in the United States or in Europe is you spend quite a bit of money doing feasibility studies and concept studies. India, we don't have that luxury. We build, we fly, we fail, we build again. So it's not as much frugal engineering as let's not go through a lot of these feasibility studies and concept study phases, which takes time and takes money. The other interesting difference, if I were to compare the Indian space program to the American space program, is that in the US, every 4 years, when you guys have a new president, the head of NASA changes. Right? He reappoints a new administrator. And that administrator then changes the heads of the various centers. You guys know there's an AIM center right here. So what happens is every 4 years, you lose momentum, you lose continuity. I mean, Bush wanted to go to the moon, Obama wanted to go to Mars, and now Trump wants to go back to the moon. So what happens in that case, guys, is sometimes very mature missions, very, very mature projects, which are almost in their final phases, get shelved. I mean, while I was living in the United States, two of my favorite projects, one was the crew rescue vehicle. It was a small plane, a space plane that would be docked to the space station to bring astronauts back in case of an emergency. That was already going through test flights in Edwards, and that was scrapped. And the other exciting project, at least from where I'm coming from, TransHab, it was a project where they were looking at building inflatable habitats, right? That got canceled. Luckily, Bigelow, which is a company based out of Nevada, took that technology, and they are now building these inflatable modules. They've put them up in space, and they're hoping to build space hotels in the future. So things happen. So in India, we don't have that luxury, and somehow we don't follow that cycle of continuously changing the head of the space change agency. So we have great continuity and sustainability in terms of our missions, our focus, our trajectory, so to speak. So I think here I've tried to say what is it that we really need to be innovative, not just in the space world, but generally speaking. And I particularly think you need a hunger to solve problems, to overcome constraints that you're sort of bound into, and you know, to push boundaries. I think that's very important if you want to innovate. Another way of looking at innovation is to see what Elon Musk is doing. I think what's wonderful about the way Elon is going about doing things is for the longest time, many of us in the space world felt it was too isolated from the rest of the world, as in it was not talking to the nanotech, the clean tech, the infotech. So I think finally space, as a discipline, has come out of that isolation. And now it's kind of, there is crossover stuff happening. There's no reason for space to exist in isolation. I think Elon, what he did is a couple of really good things. With the Falcon 9, he essentially put the whole assembly line under one roof. And he's building all the critical parts in-house. So I think that is something people should have done a long time ago, but it's something he figured out, and he managed to pull it off. So it's really, innovation is not always about building the newer, better rocket or spacecraft. It's also about process innovation. Let's go to the next one. And like I just mentioned early in my talk about how India pulled off the Mars mission in 14 months, I think that's organizational innovation. If you can collapse your hierarchies, if you can bring the team together in one room and say you have 14 months to launch, that's your launch window, and you go do it, that's in some ways having a flexible organizational structure with which you can then pull off missions of this sort. So that is also a kind of innovation in my view. Let's go to the next slide. So that's the GII, which some of you must be familiar with, the Global Innovation Index, and we rank very poorly on that one. We used to be, I think, 66th, and now we've jumped to 60th. Not much cause for celebration, but here are a couple of fine print things we should keep in mind. So recently, in recent years, India has improved its data capture mechanisms, because of which we are able to capture more of the innovative stuff that's happening around the country. Second is, this GII fails to capture grassroots level innovation. So, I mean, India is a big country. We're 1.3 billion people, and we innovate out of necessity in so many creative ways. But GII is a very structured sort of method to coming up. So I think it does fall short. So I don't think we're doing great on the GII index, but there's nothing to be upset about. I think we are doing innovation in ways that eventually will probably get into a system like this. Let's go to the next one. So Make in India campaign. So our current government, they introduced a bunch of new initiatives, including something called the Make in India campaign. And it's not just about outsourcing stuff to India because it's a low-cost, high-tech base for very many tech sectors, but it's really about also designing and making in India. Let's go to the next one. I want to take you guys into a little bit of a history. I always like to say that to put things into perspective, we have to go beyond our 24-hour clock, because time, we need to have a sense of time, a sense of history. If you think of the clock as a 100-year clock, I think I first heard a reference to the 100-year clock in a Jared Diamond lecture in San Francisco. But I think it's an interesting concept. So think your clock is 100 years. It's not 24 hours. So just 4 clocks away, like 4 circles away, it looks like the Olympic rings. So 4 clocks away in the 1600s, in 1614, around that time, the Mughal dynasty in India and the Ming dynasty in China were two of the wealthiest polities in the world, right? I mean, the United States, as we know it, is 200 years old, if you don't count the earlier inhabitants. So for a country that is so young, I think it's very important to look at countries like India and China in perspective. So when I hear people using the words emerging, it's a bit of a joke. We've been around for 5,000 years, guys. So please drop the word emerging. There's nothing emerging about us. We're just getting back into the spotlight again. So around 400 years ago, 1/4 of everything that was manufactured in the world was in the geography that's called India today, right? So its history is cyclical. It's going back there. So nothing to be surprised. We made it to Mars, no big deal. I mean, if you can do the orbital mechanics, the math, and you can get there, you make it to Mars in your first attempt. So I think it's very important to keep his historical perspective to things. Let's go to the next one. This, again, is the 100-year clock for you guys, and what I'm looking at is the space program. So in just about 50 years, we went from experimental rocket launches to our first trip to Mars. So that's pretty quick, if you ask me. It didn't take us that long. How many of you guys remember the Sputnik launch? What year was that? And when did Yuri Gagarin go to space? 61, right? So if you look at the Indian space program, it started somewhere around there, and then now in 50 years, we've made it to Mars. So it's pretty cool, I think. So where are we headed? What does the future look like? I think from a government space program point of view, it's very obvious that now India has reached critical mass. It's reached a point where ISRO, the Indian Space Agency, cannot keep up with its own needs in terms of satellites and launches. So I think ISRO, at the current rate, they build about 8 satellites a year, but the demand, the domestic mandate for our own country's mandate, they need about 12 to 18 satellites a year. And also the number of launches has gone up. So ISRO is targeting sort of 12 launches a year in the coming couple of years, then taking it up, ramping it up to 18 launches a year. We have 2 launch pads, and the third one is also going to be ready. So what I'm trying to say is ISRO, with a workforce of about 13,500 people roughly, is unable to keep up, with the number of satellites it needs to build. So the natural next step is privatization. They have started to now identify consortia of companies to hand over routine satellite building and testing, as well as PSLV assembly will be the next one that they'll outsource to the industry. So privatization is the natural next step. And I think the other exciting thing that India is starting to see is new space companies such as mine. I believe you had another speaker who was supposed to join you guys from Team Indus. Let's go to the next slide. He'll pop up very soon. But here's the thing, India doesn't have a well-articulated national space policy yet. And I think people like me who are, we don't work for the government space program, we are entrepreneurs. And the way we look at what India needs to do in the future, in the coming decades, is to come up with a comprehensive space policy, which is designed not only for sort of the government program, but also supports entrepreneurs and the industries in a big way. What I mean by that is, for the longest time, we had almost 400 companies or more that would build components, subsystems for the Indian space program, but that's, those days, imagine if you were a company building rocket engines for ISRO and you build 2 a year or 4 a year, that's not very much for you as a business. So I think we need a space policy which needs to be a little more extroverted and make it possible for the Indian industry to compete internationally. And if you look at the civilian global space marketplace, it's somewhere around 330, even 340, I think the new numbers are, $340 billion. So we need to be competing internationally and not just be serving our own space agents. It has to be both. Let's go to the next one. So this is what I'm showing you is a picture of the first satellite that was built by a private consortia. And this is one of the replacement GPS satellites. So it started, the outsourcing to the industry process has already begun. I personally think it should have started some 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But finally, they've gotten the ball rolling on that, so I'm happy about it. Let's go to the next slide. So this is actually a mock-up of the rover of Team Indus. It's called, how many are familiar with the Google Lunar X Prize? Okay, many of you know about it. So this is the Indian team that's competing in the GLXP. So the rules of the GLXP prize are that you have to privately build and land a rover on the surface of the moon and have it traverse, I think, 500 meters and send back imagery from the moon back to Earth. So there are sort of 3 steps to the competition. And Team Indus is definitely one of the top 3 teams, and they are going to be the first team to fly. Most likely the launch is going to happen early next year. But here's the kicker, guys. On the same mission, we are going to have the government space, the Indian Space Agency's rover as well. Now, that has never happened in the history of space in the world. Imagine a NASA rover and a Musk rover, or put any other company together flying on the same launch vehicle. And we have to see which one makes it. Because we, meaning humanity, we haven't yet perfected the art of soft precision landings on planetary surfaces. By the way, how many of you knew there's a rover called U2, or the Jade Rabbit, on the moon for 3 years? It died last August. It was a Chinese rover. In fact, I have another talk coming up in Seattle next month, and the title of my talk is going to be The Hemispherical Blind Spot. What I mean by that is, those of us sitting here in the United States, we kind of don't even have, even a bird's eye view of what's happening in India or China. I got a call a few months ago from someone from National Geographic. They wanted to make a documentary, a 3-part series on to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the last Apollo landings. And I was like, guys, we just had a rover on the moon and nobody even talked about it. Why don't you make a documentary on U2? I mean, I really don't care so much about the 50th anniversary of the last. So she was a bit shocked, and she said, "Oh yeah, we'll put U2 in the 3rd part of the 3-part series." But that's the whole thing, you know. So we underplay some of the achievements. I think it was a brilliant accomplishment by China to have landed successfully and, you know, had the rover pottering around for 3 years. So let's see who makes it. Maybe Team Indus, maybe the space agency. I think it's going to be and there's a Japanese mission as well on the same one. So it's really a very, very exciting mission coming up next year. I think that's pretty much the last slide. Oh, okay. All right, I was in Antarctica earlier this year. How many of you have been to the poles? Canadian Arctic, Alaska, Swedish Arctic, Norwegian Arctic. So there you go. So those are photographs from Alaska. You see there's a sort of a bird's eye view and there's a close-up of what's going on. I guess everybody is familiar with the Paris Climate Change Agreement that Trump so happily discarded. So that was signed in 2015 December. And following that, there was yet another sort of convergence of nations in New Delhi, where the space agencies came together, and it's called the New Delhi Declaration, and they pledged to jointly tackle climate change through satellite missions, through exchanging data and models and so on. So I think that, to me, is a very exciting thing that the space agencies are going to be doing together in the years ahead. Let's take the next slide. And that's my concluding slide. It's a photograph from my trip to Antarctica in March. I was invited to be part of what was called the first Antarctic Art Biennale. So this is the first, so to speak, a cultural expedition to Antarctica. We had 20 artists from around the world, and we had 8 interdisciplinary guys such as myself. And this is a iceberg, as you can see. It was quite, it was a mind-bending experience. I mean, you don't have to go to Antarctica to know that climate change is real and it's happening. I guess some of you might have even followed the breakup of the Larsen Sea ice shelf earlier this year. So, you know, Antarctica locks up, I believe, some 90% of the world's fresh water. And some 50 million years ago, it was kind of tropical, like California. It was warm. And maybe, you know, 30, 50 million years from now, it'll become warm again. But what was moving, even if you go hiking in the Alps or any of the big mountains and you see what's happened to the glacial melt, it's quite shocking. I remember sitting on Paradise Bay on one of our landings, and we could actually hear the calving of the icebergs. I mean, these loud explosions. So what happens when the calving happens, and you remember the Larsen Sea when it broke, when it sort of, the fissure finally made its way through, it took apart a 1 trillion ton iceberg out, right? And what happens with that is the glaciers then accelerate, which is why the ice shelves sort of start disappearing at an accelerated pace. So let's, and by the way, I think now that we are talking about Antarctica, I would like to mention that the Antarctica Treaty, which was signed in 1959, for most part, still holds, in the sense it's our last remaining wilderness on the planet where we aren't drilling away like we are in the Arctic. So to me, that is, in some ways, quite encouraging. And when I compare that to the Outer Space Treaty, how many are familiar with the Outer Space Treaty? It's really a very, it's not any kind of a legal framework as such. It's really soft guidelines for us to follow. And I think that is already falling apart. So it's going to be quite a challenge how we will look at the future of space exploration, ownership, property rights, whether we are landing on, you know, rocks or planets, it doesn't matter. I think it's going to be quite challenging, and space debris. Are Kate and Tyler here in the audience? Oh, hi. So we had a long-distance collaboration, a very short one. We were looking at, their team was looking at creating a debris calculator, a debris footprint calculator. Because with the new constellations going up, I think debris is going to become a bigger problem in the years ahead. With that, I think I'll call it a day. Thank you.
Great, thank you. One of the reasons that we're doing this series of presentations now is because of the things that you mentioned in your presentation. There is this sort of transformation from government programs to private sector that's going on. There is kind of increased internationalization. You see a lot of sort of different indicators that space business might be about to take off. And I'd like to ask you, what do you think for the next year or next 2 or 3 years, one, are the biggest opportunities in space, and two, what are the biggest challenges for the space industry, private sector space industry?
So the first half of the question is, what do I see happening in the next couple of years as far as private space is concerned, and what are the big hurdles, right? I think let's take a global view. I think, for example, the onset of these constellation companies, we suddenly had a bunch of them, and there were several more who were planning constellations, and I think because they were a little early in the game, the market currently cannot take more than 1 or 2, which is why Planet Labs kind of bought Rapid Eye, bought Skybox, and sort of consolidated into one entity. So I think in the next couple of years, one of the things that's really going to take off is Earth observation data analytics, using imagery from these constellations, which is high-frequency revisit, fairly affordable, and that's going to show up in our daily lives for sure. That's one big change, or one big development that we'll see. In terms of access to space, which is something which always excites me, there's a company out of New Zealand called Rocket Labs. They did their maiden launch in May of this year. There's a definite need for smaller launchers that can carry, up to, say, 1,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit or SSO. And we don't have those kind of launches nowhere, none of the countries. So I think we need to fill that gap. And the New Zealand company is one such effort, but the market could easily take 1 or 2 more such companies. And I know Virgin is building something called Launcher One. They haven't launched yet. But that's the other thing that we might see 1 or 2 other cheaper access to space kind of companies come up. The third development, privately speaking, I would say, there's been a lot of hype. There's been a lot of talk about asteroid mining and such. But recently, Luxembourg, that thimble of a country in the middle of Europe, their Minister of Economy and Deputy Prime Minister, Schneider, he announced that Luxembourg is going to be the haven, the legal and financial haven for all companies who want to do resource mining in space. So I think in the wake of that, there could be a couple of companies that might actually go, not in the next couple of years, Richard, but maybe in the next 5 to 7 years, actually go and land on, a rock of sorts and try to bring back something. There has been a sample return mission from an asteroid. It was called the Hayabusa mission, which JAXA sponsored. So I think one of those guys might make it to a rock and back. So that's sort of my near-term lens telling me what's going to happen. I think in terms of the difficulties we face as startups, as entrepreneurs, as small industries, I think the biggest problem is access to capital and the ability to scale. What I mean by that is you cannot have too many SpaceXs around, because there isn't, it's just not easy to do that. Access to capital is a big problem for entrepreneurs, say in India, in Japan. We are talking about Asia here a little bit. So unlike the United States, where you have things like the SBIR program or the STTR program or DARPA or the National Science Foundation, there are enough opportunities financially. There's a good funding ecosystem, let's put it that way. Are the venture capitalists, is private venture capital money looking to land on space enterprises? Not really. Because even if you look at Skybox and Planet Labs, they didn't sell themselves as space companies, they sold themselves as data companies. Big difference. So capital has been a problem, will be a problem until we can show that space exploration can be sustainable and there can be some returns. Scaling up is another big problem, guys. Unless you have government contracts, most companies are unable to sustain themselves. So whether it is Elon Musk flying Falcon 9 or Planet Labs flying its flock of satellites, everybody is surviving largely on government contracts. So when are we going to make that transition? It's still not very obvious. And that is a huge challenge. I think those are the two big challenges.
Open the floor.
Yeah, Dr. Mahan, it's a pleasure to be here. I had the fortune to be at Mission Control in June for the PSLV launch, 30 satellites. What was interesting was there were 30 teams there, and there was a huge sigh of relief every time one of those satellites were rejected. But one team that sat in front of me was a bunch of students. And they celebrated, and then I asked them what they were doing, and they said that apparently ISRO had a program where if the nanosatellite was less than 15 kilograms, they get a free ride. What do you make of that?
Okay, wonderful. So I think, what's your name?
My name is Murli Chirag.
Yeah, so what Murli is saying here is he was at Mission Control in Sriharikota watching a launch earlier this year, and there were 30 satellites, and there was this one team of students that was celebrating the launch of their little bird, right? So I think what's wonderful about ISRO is that, yes, it's true that they offer free launches to university satellites. So do some of the other space agencies, really speaking. So the beauty, here is what has happened over the last 10, 15 years. See, what happened to computing in the last century, in the last half of the last century, has happened to the satellite building in this part of the century. A lot of the electronics has now become affordable, off the shelf, so you can build a satellite in a university lab. I mean, in some sense, in your garage, not literally that. But what desktop did to computing, a similar phenomenon is starting to show itself in the world of satellite building. You can pretty much have a SpySat on your desktop today. So I think the excitement of the group of students of actually having put together their own satellite and seeing their baby in space, I'm sure it must have been very exciting. And I'm sure they also have mission control back at the university on a bunch of screens, and they'll be tracking their satellite and talking to their satellite. So I think that's become possible, and that is exciting. And yes, there are free launches. In fact, let me share with you an anecdote. I believe there was this young chap from Argentina who showed up in Bangalore with a small CubeSat, and he went to meet someone at ISRO, and he put it on the table and said, "That's my satellite, and you've got to launch it." And he left, and they actually launched it for him. And these small satellites are, I mean, in a way, I've heard stories. I don't know if they're real, but even if they're fiction, they're exciting. You can walk through airport security with a satellite. You can DHL it or FedEx it. I mean, we've really gotten to that. It's possible.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
You didn't mention very much about Indian weather satellites. I'm wondering whether, what is India doing in that?
So the meteorology payload is it's usually part of the INSAT series of satellites. So the INSAT is not purely a ComSat. It's called, they have multiple payloads, including transponders and meteorology payloads. So it's they call it the multi-purpose satellite.
Do they have images on them, or are they?
That's a good question. I won't be able to answer directly, but because I'm not really in that field. Yeah. But it's part of the INSAT series. So if you go in and look at the INSAT series, you can get the details of the meteorology stuff. Yeah.
The
So you worked on Mars and the Moon in the early career, and now you're doing rockets. I was just wondering, in terms of the human space program that you briefly mentioned in India, what is the focus of it? Is it building its own space station, or is it integrating one of the international programs, or sending people to the Moon or to Mars? What's the focus right now in India?
Okay, so the question is, what's really the long-term goal of the Indian human space program? I should put a disclaimer here before I answer it. I do not work for the space agency. This is just my personal view as, as an Indian, as an entrepreneur. So I think from what I think could be the long-term goal is, will India put up a space station in low Earth orbit? Likely. I mean, some of you followed the Tiangong missions. I think it's fairly exciting the way China is approaching their space program. I mean, for me as a designer, when I look at the way the Russians designed their orbiting outposts compared to how the Americans design it, or the Italians, or the Japanese, that'll take a whole lecture in itself. But I think it's wonderful to see different cultures approaching even design differently for living in space. So yes, I think India will eventually have a LEO orbiting station. What could be the long-term goal? Will we land on the moon? Perhaps. I think in our lifetimes, maybe in the next 20, 30 years, there will be a human presence of sorts on the moon. Whether it'll be permanent or sort of intermittent is yet to be seen, but I think there will be. Will India be a part of it? Yes. Will it be an international effort? Most likely. But I think the way India and China are approaching their human space thing is fairly independently, in the sense they will go ahead and do what they have to do with or without international partners. So to answer your question, there is international cooperation even on our moon orbiter and Mars orbiter, as in we have instruments from NASA, from other countries, from ESA. So, however, India takes the lead, right? So I think it'll be the same for the human space program. And I do believe that not just India, but other countries as well will look at resources. They will look at helium-3 mining on the moon, for example. It's a no-brainer. So those things will be part of the roadmap, I think, as well. Yes?
What are your thoughts on the concept of assembling long-distance spacecraft, the cislunar or even on the moon orbits, and putting a Mars mission together?
So you sort of have two parts to your question, right? One is orbiting, assembling things in lunar orbit. And also you're talking about the what was the Mars mission question again? Sorry.
Assembling a ship there and sending people to Mars. The American companies have the idea they're going to use the cislunar orbit or the moon itself to assemble large vehicles to transfer people to Mars, a space camp around Mars, orbiting Mars, and then going down to the surface from there. I'm just wondering what your thoughts.
Yeah, I think what you've brought up here is very interesting. It's some of it used to be in the realm of science fiction, and some of it has been brought into concept studies as well. The kind of architectures you're proposing, which is sort of built out in space and then transported to other planets, for example, Mars. But I think one of the fundamental shifts that has occurred in the last few years is because of 3D printing. I mean, 3D printing is still at its infancy. Like this ring I'm wearing is 3D printed. What that's going to do to space architecture, in my view, is it'll complete, we were always looking at piecemeal, what we call piecemeal architecture. So we build bits and parts of the space station either here on Earth, and what you're imagining or what you've just mentioned is sort of, given our current infrastructure, our capabilities, and our capital outlays, it's not possible for us to do that yet. Theoretically, it's possible. Technologically, it's possible. But it is, I think the costs involved and the infrastructure needed to support it, the number of launches, the kind of coordination you would need to build something like that and take it out, far out, we don't have that yet, even as a collective. I'm not talking about just India. But what I think will happen is we will be so my company in Vienna, one of the projects they're working on is they're looking at things like processes like lava casting and sintering using simulated regoliths, lunar regoliths, to see how we can build on the moon using in situ resources, right? So I think this whole idea of building piecemeal somewhere else and then transporting it is going to become obsolete in the coming years. The idea will be to build in situ if possible, like even for Mars missions. It doesn't make sense carrying stuff to Mars. Maybe supplies, yes, initially, but building architecturally like habitats and sort of extended habitats. It would be great if we can master the art of 3D printing on Mars, on Moon, and I think it's going to happen. We are now doing it at a at a lab scale. It'll get out of the labs, and I think we'll probably be testing some things in the near future. But we are some distance, we are many years away, I would say. We're not there yet. The other exciting thing that could happen is a space elevator, I think. If we are able to get the whole carbon nanotube thing out of the research phase into sort of a commercial phase at some point, we could build that tether, we could have our space elevator. And that would be exciting too, if you ask me.
Could you expand a bit on your particular effort in Earth to orbit? You mentioned you're now more Earth-looking, Earth-facing.
Yes, yes.
The activities, what sort of data you
So after I moved back to India in 2008, for about 7 years, we focused on doing these international launches. And because the Europeans were coming to India through bilateral diplomatic relations, we have good diplomatic ties, we didn't focus on Europe so much. We focused on Japan and the US. And now we've dissolved that company, and the new company is called Earth to Orbit Analytics, which is looking at how can we leverage satellite imagery with ancillary data, depending on what problem we are trying to solve, and use machine learning algorithms to solve problems, to come up with intelligence to solve problems. So the initial models or proof of concepts that we've developed are around agriculture, cities, smart cities, insurance, water, renewable energy. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. We have a model by which we can, for example, predict flood risk. Let's take a city like Houston. Can we sort of look at the existing water bodies and weather patterns, and can you sort of predict how the flood will propagate in the case of something overflowing or having, torrential rain? So flood risk modeling is one. The other we're looking at is air pollution monitoring, particulate matter. And in all of these, it is not necessary for us to limit, or you can look at urban heat islands. You can look at, say, Palo Alto, and sort of create a map of sort of where it's, the whole thermal imaging of this area. And accordingly plan your tree cover, the location of new infrastructure, how would you bring down vehicle emissions, for example. Or let's look at agriculture. Agriculture, you have to look at crop acreage, yield prediction, and risk, whether it's yield-based risk, weather-based risk, or crop health-based risk. So I think the applications are many. It's just that we have started out by looking at problems that we think are relevant and are needed in the near future.
So you've worked with people in many different space programs and many different countries in various capacities. Near the end of your presentation, you were talking about the India efforts need to be more extroverted and become internationally competitive. What do you need to do?
I think we need a generational shift. That's what we need, Richard. We need younger guys to take over. It's happening, it's coming, but I think that's the big change we need because, I grew up with what I call the pioneers of the Indian space program. My dad was one of the first recruits when Sarabhai was putting the team together back in the late 60s. He had just returned from Germany. He was one of these young engineers who got hired into this space program in the making. And those guys I grew up with, my dad's colleagues, so to speak, were a very different bunch as compared to the guys who run the space program today. The same with NASA. If you look at the Apollo guys, even today, I mean, some of them are in their 80s and maybe 90s. They're amazing. I mean, the average age in NASA used to be 26 those days, and now it's what, I don't know, 49 or somewhere there. So I think ISRO also needs an influx of young blood, and I think that will automatically make it extroverted. You can't push the older generation to be more extroverted than they possibly can be.
So I'm also curious about the kind of learning that's going on. The startup community related to space endeavors of various sorts seems to be relatively like everybody knows everybody else. Do you get that sense? Do you, what are the kind of challenges to this sort of global view from the startup perspective?
I think that's a great question. I think I would rephrase the global view as cosmopolitan approach to space exploration and utilization. So it's true that a lot of us in the space startup world do know each other. It doesn't matter if you live in California or in India or in Singapore or wherever else. And many of us have sort of views and approaches which there are crossovers. That's because we've grown up in a world which is so fluid and so connected that we kind of think without boundaries. Yes, there is ITAR and there are other hurdles that come in our way, but we also, like Skybox and Earth to Orbit, decided to sort of team up and get the first waiver to fly on a PSLV. So I think the fact that we know each other, the fact that we are comfortable to mentally and physically live in a world without boundaries, despite the boundaries, is going to bring about changes and disruptions in ways that space agencies can never imagine. So they'll have to deal with it.
Do you think things like the International Space Station help that? What are the factors? How did this become this way?
I think the International Space Station probably did play a role, but I don't think it was a pivotal role. I think social media, internet, jetliners, and the fact that I can just Skype with you if I want to and just come up with a new idea to run and chase, you know, it's really all of that. I don't think it's so much the space station program, no.
Okay.
Because the space station, at the end of the day, I mean, it's exciting to think about human space flight, but I think it's beyond that, way beyond that. Yeah?
I'd like to talk a little bit more about the legislation. So you talked about
I like to talk about legislation too. Go on.
the outer space treaty being obsolete a little bit.
Not a little bit. It's totally obsolete.
And the need for new legislation, and how already we can see countries creating some safe space havens from where to go.
What country are you from?
France.
Okay. Yeah, go on, yeah?
I just wanted to know, what's your point of view on who ought to enforce the space laws? Is it a country? Is it the UN? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think, remember I have a company in Vienna, so I interact with the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs every now and then. It's a small team of people running what we call UN-USA. So the Outer Space Treaty is under their sort of purview, but really it's already fallen apart. So who should legislate and who should enforce? I think that is a very good question. And if you look at what's happened to the United Nations, or look at UNESCO, I mean, US just left UNESCO, right? Yeah, so unilateralism will continue. And how does the rest of the international community deal with unilateralism is yet to be seen. I think several things. Let's look at some of the legislations that have come into force. So I believe the United States passed a legislation, was it last year, where it says that if a US company were to land on an extraterrestrial object and actually bring back something from that celestial body, they would own it. It would be theirs. So there was there wasn't any hue and cry because most people didn't even follow that bit of news. But some of us in the space community discussed it, and it was, so the fine print is, okay, you will own the resources that you bring back, but you won't own the rock. But that's still not very comforting, if you ask me. So here is a clear example of a country having passed legislation, and until it happens, there will be no one to challenge it. One of my lawyer friends from Poland, he went on and registered the sun as being owned by him just to trigger a conversation around it. Who can own the sun, for goodness sake? He said, I'll file, I don't know where he filed it, maybe it was, I don't know which code of law, but he just wanted to do it to provoke, right? So I think it's very tricky. There is something called the International Telecom Union. You probably know about it. There's the body that allocates spectrum, the parts of the electromagnetic. So mostly for ComSats. And that's managed pretty well. So if you're a country, you would have certain orbital slots, and those are allocated to you. If you run out of slots, then you would buy it from a country that doesn't have a space program because you want to put in more satellites. So the ITU is running quite well, but I think this whole idea of exploration and utilization of space resources, I don't think a UN kind of lawmaking body will work. Simply because, I mean, it's what's already happening on Earth, right? The UN isn't working as we would want it to be. I mean, there will be unilateralism and there will be concern. So I don't know the answer to your question, to be honest. It's still a very open-ended question, even for me. What would you recommend? What kind of regulatory body that would enforce? Even space debris. Look at the issue of space debris. I was sitting on a panel with someone from Planet Labs a couple of years ago in Moscow, and I asked him, so how many dead satellites and how many live satellites do you have in orbit? He said 87 dead, 50 live. So, and I believe there is some kind of a law which says that in low Earth orbit, your satellites, after they're dead, you kind of do a controlled re-entry and burn and get them out of the low Earth orbit. And you have a span of, 25 years or some such? I mean, it doesn't make sense. I think Tyler and Kate would know because they researched these aspects. So it's absurd. I mean, what exists as guidelines is also absurd because they are laws that were not meant to be followed, right? They were just on paper.
One more. This has to be last. Okay. Last question.
Yeah?
Just a quick one. I'm actually intrigued by your earlier comment around applications for renewable energy and smart cities. Mm-hmm. Would you provide actually more color on what applications or what markets are you looking at when you are thinking around those applications?
Okay, can I respond to the smart cities one as an example? Okay, so I think with climate change becoming so real in our daily lives, and especially climate spikes that we're seeing, there are now some city collectives around the world. There is a city collective called C40, which was started by Bloomberg in New York. There is something called 100 RC, or 100 Resilient Cities, started by Rockefeller Foundation. There is a New Cities Foundation and so on. Then India, as a nation, there's a new program that the government has sort of, I think they kind of put it into place last year. It's called the Smart Cities Mission. So in each of these programs, whether it's Bloomberg C40 or 100 RC by Rockefeller or the Smart Cities Mission in India, what we are essentially trying to, as a collective of cities, look at is how do we make our cities more resilient in the face of climate change? And that means, so each of these cities are identifying issues that are most relevant to them. I can give you the example of one city that we are starting to work with. It's the city of Chennai in the south of India. They have identified 4 or 5 issues that they want to tackle in the next 4 to 5 years. One is water. The water table in Chennai is abysmal, and they need to fix the water architecture. There are 4 river basins. They have lots of existing lakes and lakes that have disappeared. So water is one. The second they're looking at is urban rooftop horticulture. Like in France, you have this law where they say all commercial rooftops either have to have solar or horticulture. Isn't there a law like that these days? I think there is. But so Chennai is also looking at urban rooftop horticulture. That's the second. Third is solid waste segregation. I think fourth is peri-urban informal settlements, how to make that sustainable. So every city is coming up with their own issues. And if you take big data analytics, you can tackle any of these issues in very interesting ways. I can look at satellite data or drone data and be able to look at neighborhoods in Chennai and identify viable rooftops for urban horticulture, just as an example. I can potentially build what I would call a water cube, a water stack, data stack for the city. What that means is I can take satellite data from the 80s onwards. It could be Landsat, it could be other satellites, and newer data, and create a time series of what happened to water, sort of the water map of Chennai over the last 30 years and what might happen or what we could make happen. So that kind of sophisticated modeling is entirely possible. There's also a new constellation that's coming up. It's open source. It's being launched by ESA. It's called Sentinel. They'll have, I believe, 6 or 7 satellites, and they're covering many parts of the sensors will cover many parts of the spectrum. So the other thing that I'm really interested in is urban tree cover. Right? If what was the last New York mayor's name? I forget. Was it Bloomberg? Was the previous one, right? He wanted to plant 1 million trees in New York, or whatever the case might be. So how do you plan this expansion of tree cover? How do you map the heat islands in a city and sort of tackle that? Of course, there are other things you can do with cities too, like can you make a disposable income map for the city? If I'm a retailer and I want to figure out where should I put up my new stores, for example. So there are several things you can do with big data analytics.
Hope you'll come back in 2 weeks. We will not have a session next week, but 2 weeks from today we have Fleet Space Technologies, which is an Australian company that allows IoT systems in very out-of-the-way places on Earth to operate by satellite. So thanks very much for coming, everyone. Please join me in thanking Dr. Mohanty.